Good idea. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a few people in here, so I'm actually going to read this.
Okay, well, now let me introduce this. We've had a few technical glitches with our panel starting this morning, but thankfully, due to their diligence, we've gotten it all together. And this panel is about Britishness and identity in modern Britain. And we have two very interesting papers here. First, we'll be looking at Alex Lindgren-Gibson, who's going to be talking about workers, migrants, and Britons, circulating concepts about migration among Victorian working classes. Did I get that title correct?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Soldiers who enlisted in the British Army and were posted to India entered into imperial service with hazy notions of what awaited them on the subcontinent. Even by the late Victorian height of empire, men remained ill-prepared by the primary school education they received in Britain and were offered little more guidance once in India. Enlisted men relied on one another to navigate their new world. They attempted to learn languages in formal and informal settings, to understand local religious practices, and to situate themselves in their new surroundings. This paper will ask how enlisted men learned in India and consider the relationship between education and mobility, both social and geographic, for what I call these enlisted Orientalists. So I'm going to start by discussing the types of knowledge British enlisted men brought to India and the barriers to learning they encountered once there. And then I'm going to go on to think about the networks through which enlisted men conveyed both colonial knowledge and sort of imperial culture, by which I mean the practices, communication networks, shared knowledge, material world, and the workings of British rule that developed among Britons in India. Colonial knowledge, on the other hand, refers to sort of the usable knowledge of elite native Indian culture and language. So a working class British man could join the army, he could travel to India and live within and master imperial culture, which is in a certain sense a larger sort of colonial British culture without having to gain any significant colonial knowledge. So colonial knowledge had a complex relationship to social mobility for enlisted men, while elite men, who would be sons of undistinguished British families in Britain, might amass enormous amounts of wealth and social capital in India by mastering such knowledge. Working class men didn't reap the same rewards. Enlisted men were expected to support imperial rule, to follow orders, and to uphold the reputation of the British Empire. The quest for colonial knowledge was prompted by the desire to, as Nicholas Dirks puts it, know India well enough to rule it and profit by it. And so colonial knowledge was not just a method of controlling a native population, it also distinguished the conceivers of empire from its builders. British non-elites, I argue, had no need to know because they could expect neither to rule nor to profit. Colonial knowledge also had racial implications. Men who spent too much time studying Indian languages and cultures ran the risk of going native. For a non-elite population who already had worryingly close sexual and familiar relationships with Indians and supposedly lacked the intellectual fortitude needed to resist the lure of Eastern learning, the risk was supposedly even greater. Indian civil service officers, as the educated elite of the Raj, needed to acquire knowledge of local languages, but even they were required to prove their classical proficiency first to protect, in a sense, their class and racial status from the allure of Oriental learning. Enlisted men could not rely on this undergirding of respectable knowledge to bolster their own claims of Britishness. So learning native languages and cultures could only serve to bring the British soldier closer to his Indian counterparts, a result the British government was eager to avoid. Though the British Army did require enlisted men to pass exams proving minimal levels of learning to qualify for promotion, things like basic arithmetic, writing, and reading comprehension, education beyond proficiency levels was not expected of recruits. Obedience, respectability, and good relations with one's superior officers were far more likely to lead to promotion than hours spent studying Hindi. It was really only in the 1890s that a discussion of providing rewards for language attainment amongst enlisted men popped up in the India Office records. By 1895, enlisted men might earn money prize money for mastering basic levels of Hindi, Urdu, or Burmese, but they were encouraged to keep to the lower exam levels. And so the amount of prize money actually went down as higher proficiency levels were reached. The commander-in-chief for India recommended that lower ranks only strive for the first standard exam, which tested speaking skills needed for interpersonal interactions, and shy away from the second standard, which tested reading and writing comprehension. Higher levels of learning thus were considered a waste of time. Revisions to the rules for language exams immediately post the rebellion in 1858 did not make any mention of proficiency tests for enlisted men. So it was really not until sort of the memory of that major break with British rule had faded a little bit that the British government in India decided that this might be something they were willing to allow for their soldiers. So the labor that was essential to the imperial project was done by members of the British working class, but they didn't really have any education towards that labor in their schools in Britain. The education imperial subjects received in Britain before the 1870s and 1880s was almost entirely up to the whims of their instructors. And so this is where imperial culture, metropolitan imperial culture, starts to do the work of education for empire. So this is things like music hall performances, penny novels, popular magazines, sort of cheap plays, offer a random array of rumor, fact, and myth to their audiences. And so you have a group of men coming into service in India with just really kind of generalized, largely apocryphal information, much of which is sort of blown way out of proportion to create really kind of interesting fictional stories that has little to do with what they're going to experience on the ground. So once enlisted, military education was designed to make up for deficits in elementary education in Britain, not to create colonial experts. Literacy levels among enlisted men were lower than the general population until the passage of the 1870 Elementary Education Act sort of kicked in and improved people's knowledge. So what did military education look like in practice? A soldier who's only been recorded by his last name of Macpherson of the King's Own Scottish Borderers described his scholarly journey. He was born in Aberdeen, stationed in Uttar Pradesh, and in the Punjab in the first decade of the 20th century. He had worked as a lithographer before joining the Borderers. In his own telling, he had, quote, joined the army on a sudden impulse and was listed before he had time to change his mind. As a lithographer and a Scotsman, Macpherson would likely have had a firm grasp of basic reading and writing before enlisting. His education once in the army was scattered and practical. So he learned nursing, cooking, and Morse code. And he planned on using none of these skills on leaving the army. He told his friend of his intention to settle in South Africa for quarrying there, as one can earn £1 a day. So Macpherson had acquired enough understanding of imperial culture to grasp that geographic mobility opened up by military service in the British Empire would make his fortune, instead of any of the sort of piecemeal skills he had learned in the army itself. To better understand their own place in the military, social, and racial hierarchies of the Raj, soldiers turned to informal knowledge-making networks. British non-elites in the military circulated imperial culture through gossip and social interactions and through poetry and songs. They trusted European interpretations to guide their own observations. Those with the ability to record and create their own colonial knowledge developed written accounts, glossaries, and travel narratives to preserve and pass on this information. And like their counterparts at home, non-elites in India turned to literature to get a glimpse of the country they were occupying. So a man named George West, who was stationed in Burma, recorded a number of useful phrases in his notebook. And these basic words and phrases reveal a lot about how West interacted with the native Burmese population. So he noted things like buying food, clothing, and tobacco in a bazaar. He had sort of a rudimentary understanding of money, the terms for weapons and uniform components, and basic animal names. He also had phrases like stop quiet, robber, pox, I want one woman, kiss my arse, and do not flog. In common with other soldiers, West used his notebook to copy down both translations and the lyrics of popular songs. While likely intended only for his personal remembrance, judging by the profanity and references to prostitutes in the notebook, his notebook and others like it that have been preserved are the first building blocks of an informal archive of imperial culture. Reading rooms also provided a site for knowledge and knowledge building. Regimental libraries were intended to provide spaces for enlisted men to entertain themselves without resorting to drink or gambling. With little actual fighting to do, enlisted men had enormous amounts of time on their hands. Military leadership put a great deal of trust in the power of the library to quell the sexual appetites and alcoholic proclivities of the British soldier. So the Outram Institute in the Dundham Cantonment in Calcutta boasted of its collection of 5,000 volumes, including the best of the popular British press and some major British Indian publications. The library didn't fill every vacant hour, though. As Private John Brand observed, you can't read all the day. But it did provide a vast store of information to the men. And so these men had firsthand access to India. They were literally in the country. But they turned to the same written forms of information that their counterparts at home did. They read a lot of Kipling. Francis Philip Woodruff, who recounted his army service in India in a published memoir, recalled that he and his fellow soldiers didn't think that much of the accuracy of Kipling's accounts of barrack room life, which were supposed to be sort of replicating the conditions and speech and stories, the imperial culture that these men were living in. But he wrote, what interested us the most in them was his detailed accounts of native life. And so Woodruff certainly had opportunity for contact, if not necessarily sort of in-depth communication with native Indians, but he still turned to Kipling for that information. Woodruff's level of access to Indian cultures was in many ways up to him. As a private soldier in the British Army in India, he still would have been tended to by Indian servants, and he would have patronized Indian establishments. So he could choose to ask questions or converse with people or educate himself. His only recorded interactions with native Indians were exploitative and abusive. He visited prostitutes, he verbally abused shopkeepers, and he beat his own servants, and we know all of this because he wrote it all down. He took every opportunity to differentiate himself from the Indians amongst whom he lived. He very much wanted to distinguish himself as British, as someone who was going to go home to Britain, as someone who was not sort of embedded within the subcontinent. So the stories he got of native life came from these same sort of distanced sources. The figure in Kipling's tales could be viewed through a fictional lens, could be viewed through a sort of haze of history. And they were different from the people that Woodruff encountered on the ground. So Woodruff developed little colonial knowledge during his time in the country, but he was well versed in imperial culture, which he passed on both in India and back in native Wales. He proudly recounted his efforts to pass on local knowledge to new recruits on how to move through military hierarchies, on how to avoid venereal disease, the best places to buy drink, the dangers of marriage as an enlisted man, and which tattoos would be the most embarrassing when back in civilian life. And he got his information from old India hands, men whose terms of service, sometimes lasting as long as 11 years, had expired. There was a culture of storytelling in the military cantonments around Bombay, where many men began and ended their service. Woodruff situated himself as a node in these networks of knowledge transmission. He learned from those who had come before him, and he passed what he learned on to those coming after. He used his memoir for similar purposes, functioning at once as cautionary tale and fond remembrance of the hardships and liberties associated with British Indian life. So what did learning look like for people who were interested in colonial knowledge? Like most soldiers in the British Army, Private Frederick Lambert knew little about the culture or language of India when he arrived in the country. Lambert enlisted with the Devonshire Regiment in 1889, the month before he turned 19. His army papers listed his trade as blacksmith, but he had far greater ambitions. And his journals are full of scribbled alphabets and phrases in Persian, German, Urdu, Arabic, Russian, Punjabi, Turkish, Hindi, and Burmese. Though Lambert enlisted as a private and remained a private until the end of his 10 years of service, he undertook a massive self-improvement campaign during his time in the army. He took and passed the basic education exams required for promotion out of the ranks and went on to attempt to prove himself by exam in a range of Asian languages. Lambert was never able to parlay his learning into advancement while enlisted, nor did he join the police service, another option for enlisted men looking to rise socially, and one he considered. He did manage to secure a clerkship after he returned to England in 1899 and later a position with the Post Office, though he was called up again for the South African War. The culmination of his learning really came in an unpublished manuscript memoir entitled The Golden Penny. Lambert was highly observant of the landscape and people he encountered and was intellectually curious in a way that was uncommon even among elite correspondents and writers. In an early sketch of Native Indians, he was careful to note their diversity, both religious and cultural. But Lambert's knowledge was likely obtained secondhand. He makes no mention of interacting with Indians in this part of his account. What results is a mixed attempt to understand Indian life through rumor and misinformation. Lambert did make some progress once he turned more concentratedly to language study. To do so, he drew on the knowledge of the people around him. While stationed in India, he took and passed exams in Hindustani, Pashtun, and Punjabi. While his regiment moved on to Burma, he began learning Burmese, eventually hiring Mong Po Win, a police interpreter, as a tutor. In November of 1891, after 9 months of instruction, he traveled to Mandalay to take a language exam and made friends with a wealthy Karan on the train who helped quiz Lambert on Burmese for the exam. Language study seemed to have provided Lambert with a broader range of acquaintances than he would otherwise have had. He refers to the Karen man as his friend multiple times. Lambert also forged new friendships in the exam with another private and a lieutenant colonel from a different regiment. In the days following, Lambert wandered all over Mandalay, sightseeing and buying souvenirs. He met up with his Karen friend again, who introduced him to some Burmese friends, one of them being interpreter. And he says, we discussed the subject of the day for a while. So the exam system in this case facilitated such cross-class and cross-race encounters. So these are enlisted men interacting with officers and British men interacting with Burmese. But the sociability that is described in this language learning segment of the memoir doesn't really carry through Lambert's narrative. In his descriptions of Indian and Burmese dress and caste, Lambert was bemused but not openly hostile to either native people or native culture, and he was eager to learn from various teachers. This changes in his poetry. So the last 20 pages of this memoir are taken up with original poems written in a melange of Kipling style and doggerel on the subjects of India and army life. And Lambert's poetry is far more racist than any of his descriptions of native Indians in the journal or memoirs. It's entitled, ironically, The Joys of India. Lambert sort of attempts to work through the disjunction between what he sees as Indian women's ugliness and what he believes is their caste-based sexual rejection of him. So kind of like, classic incel language. So I'm going to spare you some of this, but basically he writes these series of poems warning men away from the army and arguing that the Indian women, which is sort of a metaphor for India itself, are rejecting British help. And so he's not crabby about just the women. He's also crabby about poor traveling conditions, native beggars, and the high cost of military uniforms. So there's a lot of sort of complaints encompassed in this poetry. So these poems were written in a mood of disappointment after a few years of service in which Lambert's persistent attempts at self-improvement had failed to yield any tangible results. Lambert was attempting to climb several rungs up the social ladder by proving himself competent not only to be a non-commissioned officer, but with the sort of skills that a commissioned officer would really only learn after a while in Indian service. It's little wonder that his initial enthusiasm for Indian difference resolved itself in disdain for the country that had promised so much potential for social mobility and delivered so little. A private soldier who proved himself in military campaigns, which were far and few between at this time, Lambert mentions no actual fighting in his memoir, might be promoted up the ranks. A man who had useful manual skills might eventually attain a higher status as a sergeant or corporal. These promotions were one of the few means by which working class men could make permanent upward moves in the Victorian world. But Lambert's autodidacticism had no place in the military hierarchy and so received little encouragement. His discharge papers list his education certificates, medals and decorations, and certificate of character, but they make no mention of any of the other language exams he passed because there was no space in the form to note accomplishments of that sort. The notion of a working class Orientalist fell far outside the social imaginary of the Raj and so had no place in its institutional structures. If enlisted men wanted to acquire local knowledge, then they had to rely on educational networks that operated alongside official military educational offerings. These informal educational networks conveyed both colonial knowledge, as in Lambert's train-bound conversational Burmese group, and imperial culture, as in Woodruff's discussion of his imperial experience with newly arrived recruits. This hesitation to provide formal avenues for useful knowledge to the British working class reflects elite and official British concerns about the permanence of British rule in India in particular, the problems associated with an unwanted settler population, and the ties between moral and social development. With no attempts to promote immigration to the colony, the sort of booster literature that might have tempted non-elites to the Australian outback or the Canadian prairies and offered an image, however embellished, of colonial knowledge to the metropole did not exist for India. Non-elites who attained too much colonial knowledge while in the country might choose to stay, thereby doing sort of the ultimate sin of rejecting Britain and Britishness for life in India. And because non-elites who sought out colonial knowledge from native informants, personal relationships, and the experience of Indian culture appeared to be going native, they drew derision rather than praise from the colonial government and military. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra. If it's okay with you all, I would like to hold questions till the end of both presentations, if that'll work. I think we'll have time for that.
That's fine.
And I do have a few questions on a very interesting paper. Thank you. Our second presenter today is Neal Palmer, who's an associate professor of history at Christian Brothers University. And he's going to be speaking about from new wave polarization to Britpop pride, examining Britishness through 1980s and 1990s British rock.
All right, thank you, Jeffrey. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay,
yeah.
Good. Great. Yeah, so I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully that's going to work just fine. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So this paper today is a small part, really, of a larger project that I'm working on called A Rock and Roll History of the UK. And that bigger project explores how British rock music can help us understand changes in attitudes and beliefs regarding sex, drugs, education, technology, equality, and national identity from the 1960s to the 1990s. So the paper that I'm giving today is just about part of that and on just the topic of British identity by looking at 4 bands: Duran Duran, the Smiths, Oasis, and Blur, and looking at their work during the long period of conservative rule from 1979 to 1997. So I'm going to start by looking at Duran Duran and the Smiths. And these two images here sum up the main point I'm going to make is that these couldn't be more different. The Smiths, featuring the brutal starkness and the grimness of the industrial North, and Duran Duran, though they're from the Midlands industrial center of Birmingham, present themselves as all fashion and glamour and are photographed in this sterile white environment. These two popular 1980s English bands provide meaningful insight into the state of British attitudes in the 1980s, a Britain that was politically polarized and hotly contesting what it meant to be British. Duran Duran exemplified the American-style individualism, profit-seeking, and competition extolled by Margaret Thatcher's vision of Britishness. The band is from Birmingham, but there is no sense of place about Duran Duran. Their songs make no reference to local places in British culture. Rather, they cultivate an international jet set image. The band name is from the 1968 pop art sci-fi movie Barbarella by French director Roger Vadim and starring American Jane Fonda. The band's namesake in the film, Duran Duran, is the evil scientist who invented the excessive machine that tortures its victim through excessive sexual pleasure. Band member John Taylor, writing in 2013, calls the 1980s a divinely decadent decade. He says that things shifted in that direction in 1979, away from punk rock. He writes, no more, no future. The future had been reinstated. The Sex Pistols' message was already passé. People wanted to dress up again. Glamour came back, decadent empire dressing. The nihilism that had been so crucial to fueling punk rock's beginnings had been replaced by something equally, if not more, motivational: the will to win, to succeed, to triumph. The United Kingdom elected a woman prime minister. Ambition was cool. So an example of this mindset in their music is the song Rio that was released in May of 1982. The album, also named Rio, reached number 2 in the UK album sales by mid-month. And it was at the same time that the Falklands War dominated the headlines. The song is a celebration of superficial beauty and escapist pleasure seeking. It is about a beautiful girl who knows she's something special. She likes to look at herself in the mirror. She dances on the beach and appears on TV. And when she shines, she really shows you all she can. Watching her makes the singer feel alive, alive, alive. The music is fast-paced, possibly cocaine-driven, with a driving bass line, saxophone solo, and synthesizer effects. John Taylor says the song was his idea. Rio, to me, was shorthand for the truly foreign, the exotic, a cornucopia of earthly delights, a party that would never stop. Simon chose not to make Rio about the place, but about a girl. His genius was infusing this girl named Rio with all the hedonism and romance of the Brazil of my fantasies. The video, which was in high rotation on MTV, was filmed in Antigua and shows the man riding on a yacht. Thus, it underscores the pleasure-seeking materialism of the song. Taylor comments on the video, "It was a surprisingly controversial, polarizing video. It became our most iconic video, making MTV's all-time top 10, but it was also perceived by many in Britain as an arrogant portrayal of the worst traits of Thatcherite self-interest. There would be no going back to the underground after that one. But we had no political agenda. We just went with the energy. We were riding a wave, living a dream of our own making. We didn't see what could be wrong with that." So despite his attempts to position Duran Duran as having no political agenda, it might be better to say the band had no conscious political agenda, for Taylor's outlook aligns with several aspects of Thatcherism: a pursuit of wealth that doesn't stop to worry about social or cultural cost, will over reflection, style over substance. And like over 13 million Britons who voted conservative in the 1983 general election, these middle-class young men from Birmingham seem to have bought into this outlook and then projected it through their art. So now let's shift to the Smiths, who were formed in Manchester in 1982. The Smiths released 4 albums from 1984 to 1987, all of which reached the top 5 in the UK album sales charts. The band is in many ways the antithesis of Duran Duran, and thus this comparison highlights the polarization in British identity that occurred in the 1980s. Whereas Duran Duran embraced individualism, competition, and profit-seeking, the Smiths' art is about the cultural and social oppression felt by homosexuals and the poor, and urges listeners to care for each other. The band's name is meant to sound like a family, and their Britishness is not international. Their songs have a sense of place, making clear reference to the UK and Manchester in particular. An example is their song, The Queen is Dead, Take Me Back to Dear Old Blighty, released on the album The Queen is Dead in 1986. The song opens with a sound clip from a 1962 British film in which a singer makes references to Old Blighty and London Town, Liverpool, Leeds, and Birmingham. Other lyrics refer to this land's cheerless marshes and the London tabloid, the Daily Mail. The song is about social and political issues, the public shaming of homosexuals, child drug abuse, and the line, some 9-year-old tough who peddles drugs, poverty, loneliness, and the line, life is very long when you're lonely, alcoholism, and the line, the pub who saps your body, and the emptiness of religion, and the line, the church, all they want is your money. The song's title is a statement about Britain as a whole. The Queen is the symbol of the nation, and she is dead, meaning both that people in Britain are suffering and that the more traditional version of Britishness, tied to pride in church and monarchy, is gone, or that vision of Britishness no longer provides meaning or comfort in the present. The title, much like the Sex Pistols' 1976 punk anthem, God Save the Queen, mocks the British national anthem, which contains the line, Long Live the Queen. The band does not directly name Thatcher in this song. She'd been in office since 1979, but it is an indictment of the effects of Thatcherism. The band's take on Margaret Thatcher is clearly stated by guitarist Johnny Marr in his 2016 memoir. He writes, nicknamed the Iron Lady, she abolished free milk for school children. It was a woman so contemptuous you really had to wonder if the nation hadn't lost its collective minds in electing her leader of the country. In the short time she had been in power, there was already a change in the community I grew up in. His family suffered unemployment and a sense of real apprehension took hold. She had a colossal ego, and her philosophy relied on the very worst aspects of human nature. She knew that if you put people under enough hardship, they would turn away from each other in order to protect their own interests. Her vision, like that of all conservative governments, was truly cynical in that it relied on fear, greed, and indifference towards others. And the terrible consequences of her vision would affect British people for a very long time. He later adds, the Smiths were a political band. As Margaret Thatcher carried out her systematic and ruthless dismantling of the country's industries and communities, it gave the new generation of artists a common enemy to unite against. Such was the discontent among the young. It was a given that you were in opposition to the government. And as the music press were in opposition too, they gave the bands a national platform, and we were literally all on the same page. The Smiths certainly wanted to be successful, but they were consciously not chasing commercialism. Their band image was one of disaffection, and some critics at the time coined the term miserableism to describe their music. They purposely sought out an independent record label, Rough Trade. They were anti-large festivals such as Glastonbury, which they saw as remnants of a hippie era that they rejected. They sought to craft a new lifestyle that was more appropriate for the time that they were living in. At one point, Johnny Marr says with pride that the Smiths were eccentric and subversive. And he reflects in his memoir that he was very happy that their appearance on Top of the Pops in 1983, that in that appearance, they didn't look like any of the other bands on the show that evening. They also cultivated a homosexual or androgynous image as opposed to the macho James Bond type of image presented by Duran Duran. And the Smiths embraced vegetarianism. So they celebrated alternative Britishness compared to Duran's celebration of wealth and leisure. So the tense polarization seen in these two 1980s bands lessened in the 1990s with the emergence of a kind of unity under the umbrella of Britpop. Britpop combined the pleasure-seeking, non-explicitly political stance of Duran Duran with a strong sense of place seen in the Smiths. Indeed, Britpop bands like Oasis and Blur sought to create a distinctive English-sounding rock, one that made direct English cultural references. In the case of Oasis, which was formed in Manchester in 1991, the references came in the form of trying to emulate the Beatles and other English bands rather than American or other foreign styles. The main creative force behind the band, the Gallagher brothers, Noel and Liam, worshiped the Beatles. And Liam, the lead singer, added imitation of the Stone Roses, a popular Manchester band in the early 1980s. Both Noel and Liam sported Beatles-style page boy haircuts. As a teenager, Noel was also inspired by the success of fellow Mancunians Johnny Marr and the Smiths. Liam's stage performance style, singing, and fashion choices were a combination of John Lennon and Ian Brown from the Stone Roses, who wore flare pants on stage, which were a popular youth fashion in Manchester around 1990. And he sang with a noticeable Mancunian accent. Much like the Smiths, Oasis music was shaped by their experience living in Manchester. However, unlike the Smiths, who talked about social and cultural issues directly, Oasis celebrated escapism that could be gained through drugs, alcohol, sex, and the pursuit of wealth. In this way, their music was more similar to Duran Duran, with two important differences. First, their escape was a working class fantasy contained within Manchester, not Duran Duran's glam rock, James Bond fantasy. And second, they sought escape through nostalgia for the presumably better days of the past. The cover of their 1993 demo tape, which you can see here, featured an image of the Union Jack going down the drain. Liam said of the cover at the time, "It's the greatest flag in the world and it's going down the shitter. We're here to do something about it." So it's not clear if he meant that the flag as a symbol of right-wing conservatism was the problem, or if he was voicing support for the nativist, anti-socialist views of right-wing conservatism at the time. The band's version of Britpop can be seen in their song Supersonic that was released in 1994. The song was on the album Definitely Maybe, which was #1 in sales in the UK, and at the time was the fastest selling debut album in UK history. Supersonic opens with an assertion of Thatcherite conservative ideas of individualism and the power of personal will to overcome all obstacles, combined with their own escapism through alcohol. So the opening lines are, "I need to be myself. I can't be no one else. I'm feeling supersonic. Give me gin and tonic. You can have it all, but how much do you want it?" So note the British cultural reference to gin and tonic there. Later, there is a direct reference to the Beatles' Yellow Submarine in the song, as well as references to the Beatles' 1965 songs Drive My Car and Nowhere Man. Despite these multiple Beatles references, the overall message of the song is similar to Rio. Supersonic is mainly about a girl named Elsa who appears on the cover of tabloids, drives a BMW, sniffs drugs while riding on supersonic trains, and does it with the doctor on a helicopter. The video, which was shot in black and white, shows the band playing on the roof of a building in urban Manchester in imitation of the Beatles' famous rooftop performance in 1969. As with the middle-class, brummy members of Duran Duran, these working-class Mancunians seem to embrace the Thatcher version of Britishness, with an added note of English-focused insularity, perhaps suggesting a similar shift in British conservatism at the time. A similar insularity can be seen in Blur, the other major Britpop band of the mid-1990s. Like the Smiths and Oasis, they sang about life in England, but unlike Oasis, their observations were often critical. Their perspective was decidedly middle class compared to the Smiths' working class point of view. The band took shape in the late 1980s while 3 of the band members were students at Goldsmiths College in London. The band achieved some early success in 1990-91. Their debut album, Leisure, reached #4 in the UK charts in 1991, but their American tour the following year in 1992 was a failure. They played to small crowds, they felt homesick, and they came to resent American culture. The lead singer and songwriter, Damon Albarn, told an interviewer at the time, "I just started to miss the really simple things. I miss people queuing up in shops. I miss people saying goodnight on the BBC. I missed having at least 15 minutes between commercial breaks. And I miss people having respect for my geographical roots. Because Americans don't care if you're from Inverness or Land's End. I missed everything about England." Blur's next 3 albums, Modern Life is Rubbish, Park Life, and The Great Escape, all sought to create a rock music that was inspired by English musical culture and English life. Unlike Oasis, there is no sentimental nostalgia in Blur's music. A good example is their song Country House, which appeared on the Great Escape album that reached #1 in sales in the UK in 1995. This song is about a successful middle-class man who buys a house in the country in an attempt to fend off the physical and psychological damage that resulted from his pursuit of wealth. The opening lines are, "City dweller, successful fella, thought to himself, oops, I've got a lot of money, caught in a rat race terminally. I'm a professional cynic, but my heart's not in it. I'm paying the price of living life at the limit. Caught up in the century's anxiety, yes, it preys on him." The man's effort to find health and happiness in the country is not successful, as he has to turn to drugs and psychoanalysis. There's a line, "Prozac, it's a helping hand that makes you feel wonderfully blind. Oh, it's a century's remedy." Even though he tries to be healthy, he is not happy. There are lines, "He doesn't drink, smoke, laugh, blow me out. I am so sad, I don't know why." The song satirizes the period's conservative English ideas that the heart of the nation is in the countryside and that people can achieve happiness through the pursuit of wealth. The song's cultural references are very much English. The country house, of course, and then a reference to Animal Farm. And Albarn uses the word jackanory, which is a reference to a long-running BBC children's show. The video for the song is also noteworthy. Directed by the famous British artist Damien Hirst, it does everything possible to play up the British cultural references. Bowler hats, shots of London and a real English country house, imitation of the long-running British sketch comedy The Benny Hill Show, and a reference to the band Queen's famous video for Bohemian Rhapsody from 1975. So there is a love of British culture here, but also an uneasiness about the state of British life in the 1990s after 16 years of Conservative Party rule. Many music critics were deeply uncomfortable with Britpop's representation of Britishness, particularly as another general election loomed in 1997, and these music critics warned that Britpop harbored conservative tendencies. Stephen Wells, writing in NME in 1994, charged that Britpop represented a nauseating mixture of bravado, hysteria, and xenophobia based on a hideous inferiority complex that he saw as deeply conservative in its nostalgia for a mythical English white working class culture. He argues that the global hybrid formation of rock music makes attempting to define a defendable British rock music at best naive and at worst casually racist. Doing so at a time when Nazism and racism are undergoing a Europe-wide renaissance borders on the contemptible. Another point of contention was the use of the Union Jack by Britpop bands. John Savage commented in 1995 on the bewildering blur of Union Jacks across the media at a time when, to many Brits, the Union Jack was a loaded, ambiguous symbol connected to the fascist National Front, the dominance of England within the United Kingdom, and conservative calls for England First policies. He argues that Britpop's use of the Union Jack politicized their music. He writes, "National symbols are always ambiguous and hotly contested. Britpop has succeeded in reclaiming the Union Jack from the far right, but in claiming to represent the UK, it has fallen short." He adds that Britpop highlights the perennial schism of pop politics, industrial conservative in its concentration on and celebration of numbers and success, emotionally labor in its sympathy for the underdog and the dispossessed. Britpop reflects nothing less than the struggle for the nation's soul. And then a third criticism was that Britpop's celebration of ordinariness might encourage British voters to accept a continuation of the mediocrity of a conservative government. The music writer Johnny Cigarettes wrote in 1996, John Major could be in Oasis, give him a Beatles wig, a Ben Sherman, and a pair of shades, tell him to look vaguely bored, and no one would notice if he turned up on third guitar or keyboards. And why the hell not? Noel Gallagher and John Major have a lot in common. Both are leaders of the forces of conservatism in their chosen fields. Both are unashamedly populist modern everyman figures. And above all, both are profoundly, determinedly, deliberately ordinary. As such, aren't they perfect anti-icons for the 90s? Because if the 80s were made by, for, and about extraordinary people, aspirational and inspirational individuals who stood out from the crowd, then the 90s have been molded and characterized by ordinary people. He says that Oasis exemplify this 1990s embrace of ordinariness. If the biggest rock band in Britain are at all extraordinary, they're extraordinary at being ordinary. Everything about them is informed and straitjacketed by the conservative fear and loathing of looking ridiculous, flamboyant, or different from the bloke on the Didsbury omnibus. He adds that being common is the worst thing in the world to be. It's tragic and pointless. You haven't got to be yourself. You can't be no one else, referencing that first line from Supersonic. You can be anything or anyone you want to be. Haven't we learned that by now? Do we still want to know? We get the culture we deserve. So this paper has attempted to describe 4 examples of the expression of British national identity in popular rock music during the 1980s and 1990s. The 1980s saw significant polarization in British identity as Margaret Thatcher's term as prime minister bolstered supporters of conservatism and angered the political left. 1980s new wave rock reflected this polarization as seen in the comparison of the music of Duran Duran and the Smiths. By the mid-1990s, British popular music reflected a shift in Britishness towards prideful insularity coupled with angst. An examination of the work of Oasis and Blur from this period shows a renewed pride in British culture as something interesting and unique, and a desire to push back against American cultural dominance. Several leftist music critics in the mid-1990s commented that the Britpop turn towards insularity, nostalgia, and celebration of ordinariness encouraged conservative tendencies in British identity. So these popular songs provide insight into the beliefs and feelings of British youth during a period when national identity was contested and shifting. The bands and individuals are all white and male, so they certainly don't represent all Britons during this period. But since their music was widely popular, it clearly struck a chord with a significant part of the British population. Therefore, it can help us understand the beliefs and attitudes that existed at particular moments during the long period of conservative rule. All right.
Thank you, Neal.
You're welcome.
2 very interesting papers, and I have just a few questions and comments, but I want to also make sure that we open it up to the audience if anyone is out there to ask questions. So I'll keep my couple questions very short, and then we can just kind of open it up to a discussion, if that's okay. I thought I'd start with Alexandra. Was going native a real problem for the British in India?
It was anxiety, not necessarily an act. Like for the people who stayed there, married Indian women, they were completely fine with it.
Okay.
The problem came with, there was like a real concern about what would happen to the next generation, right? That comes out of this. So like if soldiers decide to stay, they maybe have a relationship with a woman, they maybe get married, they maybe don't. They are essentially creating a settler population in a colony that Britain had no interest in creating a settler population in. And then they inevitably produce children, which creates this whole other, like, are they British? Are they not British group of people that the state then has to deal with and has to essentially decide, like, what is their race? How do we educate them? What responsibilities do we have towards them? And also, now we have all these guys wandering around sort of visibly not being properly British, and sort of undermining our, claims to like superior morality. So it was not actually a problem, but the British government thought it was a big problem.
Sure, because I guess it blurs the line between the conqueror and the colonist. And I wonder, it sounds like a lot of these soldiers did not take advantage that much of the opportunity to move up in India and then come back to England and do something with that. Was it just the fact that they had been in foreign service? That was enough to kind of give them that exotic edge when they come back, or are they actually kind of trying to move up a little bit in English society, which they probably wouldn't be able to do back in England?
I mean, some people were. Some people, I honestly think it wasn't, I haven't seen any evidence that, there was a way of gaming the system properly, or that people were thinking about it in that kind of way. I sort of studied sort of like this larger group of working class British people in India in this period thinking about social mobility. And a lot of it has to do with, did you have skills that were of particular use to the military or to railway companies? And if you did, then you could sort of move up the ranks. Everyone's condition, to a certain extent, was improved in India because they had this sort of like all of these Indian servants there to look after them. So essentially, if you were in a position where you found yourself improving your social standing, you could return with that back to England. But for a lot of people, it kind of faded away once they got back and so this was one of the reasons that people may have decided to stay on as well, right? Like, if you find that you are living a moderately better quality of life elsewhere, you might choose to stay in India, or you might choose to move on to, like McPherson, who I mentioned, choose to move on to one of the colonies, the settler colonies, who were eager to bring on British of whatever class, just to kind of fill up space.
Like South Africa.
Yeah, like South Africa, like Australia. Yeah. Okay,
I think that's interesting that we don't see a lot of people trying to jump the class barrier in India. Take advantage of that coming back to England.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it becomes too messy there to, people's class status becomes so messy there that it's difficult to transfer what has happened in India back to a British context.
Okay, yeah. That's and I found some similarities in the two papers regarding maybe class and class lines. And so, Neal, I was going to ask you if these bands, it sounds like what you say about Duran Duran is very correct. Do we have any idea about who was listening to this? Do we have an idea of, was the fan base of Duran Duran also maybe conservative and upper middle class versus the Smiths? Did they have a fan base that was maybe more liberal or more on the edge at that time?
Yeah, well, that's definitely something I would love to know more about. That's the kind of detail that's, I think, really hard to track down, because there's evidence of record sales, but who exactly is buying the records is something that's really hard to know. You can track it, and I gave a little bit of that through the music press, right? And the music press's reaction. And since the music press at the time was very leftist in their leaning, they were critical of Duran Duran. I didn't give any music press clippings in there, but they definitely, but they didn't really take it, I don't think, as a serious thing in the early 80s, as much as it seems to be later in the 80s. There seems to be a much more critical attitude, I think, among the music press about bands that aren't alternative like the Smiths. So I don't know if there hadn't really been a position staked out for the left within rock music before, say, the mid 80s. I think Duran Duran is sort of before that. And I think everybody was listening to Duran Duran, but how much I guess, your question gets into something that I'm very interested in, and that's, is their music, is their music actually having any kind of causal effect on like changing opinion or generating type of political stances? And that's a very difficult thing to prove for any culture connecting over to politics. So I try to be careful about, not making those claims too strongly. Although in the larger thing that I'm writing, I try to say the bulk of the evidence suggests that may be indeed happening, right? That if people are listening to these songs and are being inspired by them at all, then it seems to be, if it had an effect at all, it was pushing them over towards, supporting conservatism, whatever walk of life they were from.
Yeah. Maybe letting them feel comfortable about conservatism during the Thatcher years.
Yeah. Because they make it look fun and exciting,
Wow.
So.
I remember some people, who criticized the Beatles were saying, well, you guys are writing about drugs and stuff, so you're driving this whole thing towards a liberal drug-oriented culture.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, well, no, we're following events. We're not driving events. We're
Right.
just reading about what we see. And maybe some of these bands were doing the same thing, just basically expressing what they saw.
Well, that is the important point, right? Are they reflecting the culture, or are they also shaping the culture, through the process of reflecting it? And that's a difficult thing to untangle. I totally agree, but I'm trying to do that in the bigger book, and I've been teaching a class in this for about 6 years, and I'm increasingly convinced that yes, they are having an effect that is beyond just a reflection, right? That they do have some agency in creating, particularly a band like the Beatles, who were so famous, right? I mean, there really wasn't another rival voice within the pop music world, at least from 1965 to 1969.
Mm-hmm.
They were so dominant that to say that they didn't have an influence on making people aware of that culture, the drug culture, right, the underground culture, even Indian culture, right, through their interactions with Ravi Shankar and their travel over to India. So anyway, I mean, all of that seems to me to be a lot of evidence that would be hard to just brush aside as having no cultural effect, right, or even political effect at the time. So
yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, yeah, I agree. That's interesting. And yet, as much as we criticize the Thatcher years, it doesn't sound like there was any attempt to silence these bands or, kind of push back against them by the government.
Well, that actually did happen in the late 80s. There was a pushback against what was called the Manchester scene and rave culture. So that was very much tied to taking ecstasy and going to these big parties. And the Thatcher government, they actually did pass laws that it made it that criminalized creating these big parties, as that parties would usually happen on like vacant lots or unused buildings. And so they did try to criminalize it and shut them down. But the bands were the people that were organizing these raves were able to do it in a way that was even before social media. It was kind of impressive the way they were able to just like kind of call each other like 2 hours before the event and get the word out. And then, 2,000 people would show up in the middle in the countryside outside of London. But the Thatcher government was really bothered by that they couldn't control that. Right. And so and the music press loved it.
Okay. Yeah. I remember hearing about that. That's interesting. Well, I'd like to see where this goes. One last thing for Alexandra. You mentioned the Education Act. Did things get better or different later, like in the 1900s?
Yeah, I mean, people were better. They had like a better degree of basic education, basic literacy across Britain. But again, in terms of, understanding anything about the empire, it was still relatively underwhelming. There was some sort of, within like the various levels of what you ought to learn at each grade in school, there was some sort of like, here's a selection of books that might be useful in understanding the rest of the world. But, just like today, they could take them or leave them, and the quality of education totally varied.
Okay, yeah, I guess, the notion of empire carried certain responsibilities that if we're going to be sending British people all around the world, maybe we should educate them a little bit better about where they're going.
Yeah,
So,
but I mean, I think also just like thinking in terms of class again, like, people had very few options. The military was one of them. It didn't really matter if they were like properly trained.
Good point.
In order to, I mean, it probably would have, it might have caused better relations once they got there, but that wasn't necessarily something the government was particularly interested in either.
True. And we have all these men in the military and really not doing much fighting, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
So they have a lot of time on their hands.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. I don't know if we have an audience out there. Can you all tell? I mean,
we have 2 audience members.
Okay. Well, I would welcome them to ask any questions or make any comments if you would like. I think just turn on your microphone if you want. Well, I like both these papers, and I'd like to maybe hear more about where they're going later on. To me, the one unifying theme seems to be class, which is so important in England and Britain. Class differences often have, in my opinion, made big differences in entertainment and music, and certainly in colonial activities as well. So that seems to be one thing that we, in English history, we just never get past class.
I mean, one thing I was thinking about while Neal was talking and with your comments as well was how awkward the idea of attempting to rise in class is within sort of the British context, right? And that actually starts to break down in the 80s. But just the idea that you would like be trying, it's terribly embarrassing in British culture. And you see a little bit of a difference there once you get to Thatcher.
I definitely see that in reading their memoirs and stuff. The other thing that you can layer on top of that are the bands from the North or from the Midlands. They also feel a double type of barrier, not especially if they're working class, but that and then trying to break into the London scene, right? So they feel oppressed doubly because of their region. And because of and then the members of the Smiths, they were, well, at least the 2 main, Morrissey and Marr, they were also the children of Irish immigrants. So they also had a Catholic identity and an Irish, prejudice against them that they were battling against. So all of that certainly, I think, maybe helped them fuel that kind of critical attitude that they had towards the government. They definitely felt that oppression really heavily.
Yeah. That's really interesting because I was wondering about regionalism as well. Right. Because, by the time it's like the mid-90s, like you could promote Manchester as like a tourist destination. Right. But like earlier than that, why would you go there? It's gross.
Yeah, and it becomes a tourist destination because of the music.
Yeah,
it's only in the late '80s when that Manchester scene is happening, and the music makes it interesting. Mm-hmm. And the same thing for Liverpool back in the '60s. It was an afterthought until the Beatles made it a place where people at least knew where it was, right, and people could recognize the accent. Alex, I did have a couple of observations about your paper. I'm sorry I didn't hear the whole thing. I was actually. I did a conference paper 2 weeks ago, mm-hmm. and the entire panel was on Britain interacting with India, mm-hmm. and I did a paper on the Beatles. Mm-hmm. But there was one presenter there who did a paper on on World War II, but she's actually Indian. She was she was telling of this story from the Indian perspective, and during World War II, and she said that first on three things I remember from her paper is, first of all, that there was a lot of curiosity among the Indians about these visiting soldiers. Not so much the British soldiers, but definitely the American soldiers.
Right.
Like, they were very interested in the American soldiers. And then there was a lot of concern among the native Indians about Indian women having sexual relations with these visiting soldiers. And so it was written about in the newspaper. There was in Indian language newspapers. There were letters to the editors of these newspapers. Women would tell their stories about how this soldier had sex with them and then left, and they were left with this child that they had to. So anyway, they really played that up, right, and that helped create concern. But then, despite all of that, she also said that within the Indian sources, that there was a lot of special privilege given to these military personnel, being allowed to interact with Indian women, right? Despite the fact that there was this awareness of this potential fear, and that the children that came out of these these relationships tended to have a special privileged status within these societies when they got to be a little older, which I thought was really unexpected. But they weren't
with Americans.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if she distinguished between the Americans and the British in that regard, but maybe it was. I think maybe she was talking about the American couples.
Yeah.
So anyway, I thought that was all really, and also I was thinking about how I don't know a whole lot about this, British people traveling to India and then coming back, but I have read all the George Orwell stuff, and of course he presents this model of a Briton who goes to India or Burma, right, and becomes very critical of imperialism while he's there, seeing it from the inside. And then when he moves back home, he seems to have brought that critical attitude towards Britain back home and turns it on British culture, British society. So I think that's an interesting relationship between, kind of identity and questioning your own identity through the experience of imperialism. So I didn't hear a lot of that in the memoir that you were talking about, but not everybody's a deep thinker as George Orwell, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these memoirs are written by people who sort of primarily identify as soldiers. So they're thinking of themselves, even though they've spent the entirety or almost the entirety of their military careers in India, they're sort of thinking themselves in relationship to the military primarily. And even are sort of following just a general kind of form or template of a soldier's memoir. And because of that, they can be critical of joining the army generally, or of how Britain is behaving in India, but they don't necessarily then take that back to criticizing Britain itself. They continue to think of themselves, as British or English or Scottish or whatever their sort of primary affiliation is, with this additional kind of overlay of experience. And I do kind of think about why that gets subsumed within their storytelling. And I think it's difficult, it's difficult to reintegrate yourself back into a community if you've had all of these experiences that separate yourself out from it, right? And so, once you've told your when I was in India story 17 times and your family is oh my God, maybe you'd stop. So that's part of it. Oh yeah, and then this whole sort of relationships, there's really long kind of history of concern about that. And there's in the independence movements, even starting around the 1880s, 1890s, in Indian newspapers, there are all these kind of reports of British soldiers who have, sexually assaulted or harassed women, being used as sort of an argument for we got to get these guys out of here. So it's interesting that the American soldiers might be thought of as different, right? They're not thought of as soldiers, they're thought of as American.
Yeah, liberators maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking about the UN Charter the other day, and that document was so shaped by the United States, and it's definitely got that powerful anti-colonialism language.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were talking about in class, and we were comparing it to the League of Nations
Mm-hmm.
language, which was British, and French formed, and thinking about if you were a person in India or in Africa or in the Middle East. And it was an educated elite, right? And you were reading these documents, the founding of the League of Nations compared to compared to the United Nations, how inspired you would be, and how much encouragement you'd be given by the United Nations language that talks about human rights, right,
Mm-hmm.
and the need to develop the populations, and so I think that rings true that they would see the United States differently, right? Not as an oppressor, but as a liberator.
Yeah.
And maybe that would then be projected onto their soldiers, even though it would maybe not be true at all.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, British soldiers spent a lot of their time sort of contained in these army camps, right? So they weren't necessarily I don't know, walking around handing out candy bars and nylons. I don't know what soldiers do in World War II, but
Right.
We did get one message from somebody in the audience, Stephen Stillwell, who is the new vice chair for the AHS. He couldn't get his microphone on, but he said kudos to both presenters. So he was watching and listening. I agree. I think both papers were really good. And I'm going to mention something to the folks at SHA about the video and audio issues, which I still don't understand where they came from. But I appreciate your patience in that and your diligence in holding on. I was about to give up, but rebooting my computer magically fixed it. So who knows?
It usually does.
Yes.
Well, hey, Jeffrey, thank you for sharing this.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
I was like, oh, it's not my fault. Someone else can fix it.
Glad to do it. Like British history is my specialty, although I'm mostly teaching American history these days. But yeah, it's good to read papers on English history again and comment on them. I enjoyed both of them.
Thank you.
So hopefully, I think you probably know that next year is in Baltimore, and hopefully it will be an in-person conference. We'll get to do this without all the video and Zoom. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately got to get on the road and start driving to campus, start teaching. Stephen, I think, gave a thumbs up, or applause. So
thank you
both for your presentations. I enjoyed them a lot.
Okay.
Take care and have a good day.
You too.